Hey, warmer from the low, welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. We've got an excellent podcast for you. We've got another conference preview edition today. Taking a look at the Atlantic 10, a very fun conference, a conference that has been up, down, and all around the last few seasons, and a man that he's always on the up and up. He does such an amazing job. Taking a look at this great game of college basketball, Kevin Sweeney is over at SI now. He does a great job over at the Field of 68. He's going to be joining me in segment number 2. We're going to be talking about all 15 of these rosters, looking at the coaches in this conference, who's all coming in, who's all going out. So we're going to be discussing that here in the first segment. Going to be taking a look at the styles of play and betting trends for the Atlantic 10. And then in the final segment, going to get you guys my projector finish for this wonderful conference. If you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of two ways we offer those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at unit_D1. Keep in mind, letters UM, name does not matter. So as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And since I'm doing a conference preview today, that means that the last 48 hours of college basketball news and notes, anything that I missed for Wednesday, that's going to be all polished up on the podcast tomorrow. So let's get down to business and let's look at an Atlantic 10 where slow and steady wins the race. We have seen it the last few years in this conference that the teams that play a more slow and methodical style have often been the teams that have gotten the job done. Lone exception is Davidson. Davidson was towards the bottom of the conference last season. It's been a little bit of a tough changeover ever since Bob McKillop decided to step down and sent the reins over to Matt McKillop. As for Davidson, just 5-13 in conference last year, and in terms of total possessions per game, they were clocking in 351st in all of college basketball, but your top teams like Dayton was certainly there. A team that was able to get an large bid to the NCAA tournament, 346th. George Mason, 345th in all of college basketball. They had a nice year under Tony Skinn. You saw VCU played quite slowly last year as well. They were well outside the top 250 in terms of their total possessions per game, and it has been a case where we have been seeing a lot of these teams play some very just interesting styles with regards to the offense as well, like VCU, Dayton. They were able to shoot really well from three. St. Bonaventure, always a slow and steady team, 306th in the country in terms of total possessions per game, and as a matter of fact, VCU number 307 in terms of total possessions per game, and then the team that both made the NCAA tournament and won a game in the NCAA tournament, Duquesne. They very much built themselves on the defensive side of things, 287th in terms of total possessions per game. And don't forget about Richmond. It went 15-3 in the conference last year, 271st in the conference in terms of total possessions per game. Meanwhile, the teams that they tried to speed up a little bit more, they had their issues. You did have St. Joe's be a middle-of-the-road team, about 169th in terms of total possessions per game. They were able to have some triumphs within the conference, but you saw Fordham, who was 74th in the country in terms of total possessions per game. That did not necessarily work out for them. St. Louis was just absolutely awful on defense. They were well outside the top 300 in terms of points allowed on a per possession basis, and they just really couldn't find their rhythm under Travis Ford last season. They were a team that was looking to play a little bit more quickly than most last year, at about 153rd in the country in terms of total possessions per game. So very interesting landscape here with a few other teams that were a little bit more mid-tempo, that were more towards the middle of the conference, but it was a little bit, for lack of a better term, a make-or-miss league, and that's a big reason why St. Louis decided when they canned Travis Ford that they brought in Indiana State's Josh Schertz, who had Indiana State 7th in the country in terms of points scored on a per possession basis and 11th in terms of their three-point shooting percentage, as Dayton, who was able to get that at-large bid into the NCAA tournament, number 3 in the country in terms of their three-point shooting percentage. But VCU was also a very rock-solid team from three-point range. They were within the top 199th in the country in terms of three-point shooting percentage and shot a staggering 36% from three-point range when they were on the road last season. Loyola Chicago, another team that was well outside the top 225 in terms of total possessions per game last season. They were 60th in the country in terms of their three-point shooting percentage, was able to do a pretty rock-solid job with their defense. Richmond, again, they went 15-3 within the conference. They were number 46 in the country with regards to their three-point shooting percentage. And St. Bonaventure, 34th in the country in terms of their three-point shooting percentage. Meanwhile, the teams that struggled a little bit more, Sans Duquesne. Duquesne was a little bit of a different story. They were about 177th in the country in terms of their three-point shooting percentage, but they were able to persevere despite that. Heck, even George Washington was 72nd in the country in terms of their three-point shooting percentage. They were able to shoot as a collective about 35.8% from three-point range, but a lot of the teams that they had their struggles in terms of being able to hit the deep shot shots, they were the teams that really struggled, like Fordham 297th in the country in terms of their 3-point shooting percentage. That turned out to be a little bit more doomsday for them. UMass was able to persevere because they had great rebounding, but if they shoot 303rd in the country from 3-point range, much like they did a season ago, that's going to be a little bit of an issue. They were able to make do because they were in the top 15 in the country in terms of percentage of missed shots that resulted in an offensive rebound, and this is a conference that does reward good 3-point shooting defense as well, because I was talking about it, a lot of the best teams, they're able to hit their threes, but they also take advantage of the bad 3-point shooting defenses as well. As you saw VCU along Dayton do a pretty solid job of being able to lock things down from 3-point range. For Dayton, they were 62nd in the country in terms of opponents' 3-point shooting percentage, and VCU able to do a really nice job at number 38 in all of college basketball in terms of opponents' 3-point shooting percentage. Meanwhile, once again, to go back to George Washington, a team that they shot it relatively well from 3. They were 241st in the country in terms of their opponents' 3-point shooting percentage, allowing opponents to shoot north of 39% from 3-point range on the road. George Mason had their issues with this as well, 243rd in the country in terms of their opponents' 3-point shooting percentage, and Fordham, despite the fact that they were actually a top 75 team in terms of points allowed on a per possession basis, 305th in the country in opponent's 3-point shooting percentage. That just simply was not cutting it. Meanwhile, Duquesne, 53rd in the country with this regard as well. And then you saw the Richmond Itsy Bitsy Spiders be a team that was 42nd in the country with this regard, while Rhode Island, a team that really struggled, 298th in the country in terms of opponent's 3-point shooting percentage, and St. Louis, 330th in the country in terms of opponent's 3-point shooting percentage. So it really did play a big role. Meanwhile, a team that was more in the middle, St. Bonaventure, they were 148th in this category. And when it comes to the Atlantic 10, you do have quite a bit of travel. I'm not going to call it like just absolutely Herculean travel or anything like that. This is not going to be like Rutgers having to head out to the state of California, but this is a little bit more of a spread out Atlantic 10 where you've got a lot of teams that are in the northeast part of the country and like the state of New York and the state of Pennsylvania, and then you do have to travel out to Illinois to play against Loyola Chicago, Missouri to play against St. Louis, and did think that was very interesting what we saw in terms of against the spread trends, as you had a few top teams and you had a few bottom teams. It was very balanced in terms of overall against the spread trends, as you had 3 teams cover north of 56.8% of their games. UMass won 18-13 against the spread, VCU 22-14-2 against the spread, Richmond 21-1-1 against the spread, and then you had your rusty anchors. You had 4 teams that covered fewer than 46.5% of their games. Fordham was 15-18 against the spread. George Washington 14-17 against the spread. St. Louis 13-19 against the spread. Rhode Island 12-19 against the spread. You can tell that the teams that were at the top of the conference, they were able to cover games, and the teams that were at the bottom of the conference, well, they weren't able to cover games, as this was a conference that, even though we saw a lot of parity in the Atlantic 10, it was one where those top teams were able to come through, but it was very much an underdog league, as you only saw 3 teams in the conference be able to cover north of 52.5% of their games as a favorite. Richmond in the role of favorite, 14-5 against the spread. VCU 14-10-1 against the spread, while St. Joe's, they were able to go 12-9 against the spread. Had a lot of 50-50 teams. George Mason, 11-10-1 against the spread as a favorite. UMass, 12-11 against the spread as a favorite. St. Bonaventure, Loyola Chicago, 11-11-1, and Loyola Chicago, 10-10 against the spread. But these bottom teams, they just weren't able to cover as favorites. George Washington, 5-8 against the spread as a favorite. Davidson, 5-9 against the spread as a favorite. St. Louis, 3-6 against the spread as a favorite. And then Fordham, the Rams, they went 4-8 against the spread as a favorite. So a little bit less than savory there. And I was talking about just the overall travel in the Atlantic 10, what it meant on a lot of these teams, and a lot of these teams very used to it. You had only one team cover fewer than 45.5% of their games on the road. George Washington went 4-6 against the spread on the road. You had Rhode Island go 5-6 against the spread on the road. St. Joe's and LaSalle both won 6-7 against the spread on the road. And then Davidson, St. Louis, they go 6-6 against the spread on the road. And then from there, Duquesne, St. Bonaventure, 6-5 against the spread on the road. Richmond, 7-6 against the spread on the road. VCU goes 9-3 against the spread on the road. And then Fordham, UMass, Dayton, all either 6-4 or 6-4-1 against the spread on the road. George Mason and Loyola Chicago, 7-5 against the spread on the road. So a lot of these teams were able to do a pretty rock solid job on the road, and a lot of that is just because in general this team was able to take care of their business in the non-conference portion. They didn't always get outright wins, but you saw only 4 teams in this conference cover fewer than 50% of their games in non-conference play, which tells you that this was a little bit of an underrated league last season. As Rhode Island 5-7 against the spread in non-conference games, Fordham 5-8 against the spread in non-conference con. Duquesne went 5-9 against the spread in non-conference games. They had a miserable start to the season, and then Loyola Chicago 4-9 against the spread in non-conference games. But St. Joe's, they were not average. It was 11-3 against the spread in non-conference play. UMass goes 8-4. Davidson, along with George Mason, they both go 7-4 and 7-4-1 respectively against the spread in non-conference games. Richmond 8-5 against the spread in this regard. VCU 8-6-2 against the spread in non-conference play. St. Bonaventure 6-5-1 against the spread. Dayton 7-6-1 against the spread in non-conference play. And then St. Louis, LaSalle, George Washington. They all cover 50% of their games. And when it comes to totals, because you notice it in the Atlantic 10, lots of teams are not necessarily playing with a whole bunch of tempo, and yep, that meant that you had a whole bunch of unders in this conference, as you had 4 teams within the conference play more than 51% of their games to the over. Dayton was 18 overs, 14 unders, and a push. St. Bonaventure, 19 overs, 14 unders, and then St. Louis, 19 overs, 13 unders, and Rhode Island, 18 overs, 13 unders, while Duquesne was really one of your best under teams. Forget about the Atlantic 10, but in all of college basketball, 71.4% of their games go under the total. You had 10 overs, 25 unders, and 1 push. Marist and Vermont were the only 2 teams in college basketball that had a higher under rate. And then you had a trio of teams between about 59.5% to 60.5% to the under. VCU 23 unders to 15 overs. Davidson 18 unders to 12 overs. And then LaSalle 19 unders to 13 overs. You had Loyola Chicago go 18 unders to 14 overs. Richmond 17 unders, 15 overs, and a push. And then pretty much UMass, George Washington, George Mason, they all went 16 unders to 15 overs. And you did see Fordham and St. Joe's play one more over than under. And when you got to conference play, that's where you saw things really start to open up a little bit more for these teams, as out of conference, that's where you were able to see these teams really be able to form their identity and be a little bit more hard-nosed, especially Loyola Chicago, 10 unders to 3 overs when they were outside the conference. Had a lot of teams that went 7-5 to the over in non-conference games. George Mason, Rhode Island, St. Louis, LaSalle, all in that vector, while Fordham went 8 overs to 5 unders and UMass went 8 overs to 4 unders. Meanwhile, St. Bonaventure, George Washington, they had a 50-50 split to unders in non-conference play, in Duquesne and St. Joe's in non-conference play, 8 unders to 6 overs. Meanwhile, in conference play, you did have St. Bonaventure and St. Louis be able to lead the way in terms of overs. 12 overs to 8 unders for St. Louis, and St. Bonaventure 13 overs to 8 unders. But the teams that were playing slowly, they were really able to take hold. Duquesne, 4 overs, 17 unders, and a push in conference play. LaSalle, 14 unders to 6 overs. They're coached by Frank Dunphy, a guy that likes to slow it down in conference play. UMass Davidson, 12 unders to 7 overs. VCU, 13 unders to 9 overs. Richmond, George Mason, 11 unders to 8 overs. Fordham, 11 unders to 9 overs. George Washington, 10 unders to 9 overs. So you really saw things just clamp up a little bit more, and the teams that were playing a lot of overs in non-conference play, in conference play, it was a little bit reverse, and vice versa. So those are the betting trends and the styles of play in the Atlantic 10. Now let's take a look at all these rosters that we've got. We've got 15 in total, a lot of fun ones, and our good friend Kevin Sweeney, he does a great job covering all of college basketball, especially this conference. He's joining me next to break down these teams in the Atlantic 10 right here on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peterson, now part of the Beast and Family Podcast, the Atlantic 10 Conference Preview Edition. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peterson, now part of the Beast and Family Podcast. This is the Atlantic 10 Conference Preview Edition, and always great to get this man aboard for it, as he joined me last year on this, as it is Kevin Sweeney. He does an amazing job over at SI now, along with the Field of 68, taking a look at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball. I know that he is very much looking at all of these teams, as he does his traditional 1 through this year 364 rankings for every single T1 team, a labor of love, and one that he does also well. And you're able to follow Kevin on Twitter /X at CBB_Central all together. And Kevin, it's always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Yep, working away on that 1 to 364. It is, as you said, a labor of love. And happy to say I'm pretty far ahead of schedule for usual, so it's in a good place.
Yes, absolutely. And hey, we're doing well on these previews as well. It's the middle of September, and we're at the Atlantic 10, a big conference, and that's what we like to see. And we do like to see some big-time names coming into this conference. But one team that really didn't bring a lot in the transfer portal, that'd be Davidson. The transfer from Bob to Matt McKelp, you figured that it would be a little bit rocky. The team has won about 31-33 over the last 2 seasons, but they're going to be returning 3 of last year's top 4 scorers to make up for not really bringing in a ton via the transfer portal, with Connor Kuchera, Reed Bailey being big parts of the team along with Bobby Durkin. How do you take a look at this Davidson team, one that has had a little bit of a tough time finding their footing under the younger McKillop?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. They're a team that maybe being overlooked a little bit in the preseason. They have struggled under Matt McKillop. He has a lot to prove, but Davidson has for so long been a great 3-point shooting team. And last year they really struggled. I think in the bottom 40 nationally in 3-point shooting. I don't think that continues with just the roster they've built. Zach Lepoux, the Division II transfer, should help them a lot in the backcourt, both as a playmaker and a guy who can make threes. Obviously, losing Grant Huffman at that point guard spot, a big deal, but I think Lepoux has a chance to really help. You mentioned Durkin. He's a guy who can space it. Reed Bailey has a bit of a jumper, and then Koshera, who's back as well. Circle Roberts Blooms, international kid coming over from Europe, really big pedigree. I believe a Latvian kid. He has a chance to be rotation player right away. So maybe cautious optimism with Davidson. I think it'd be easy to pick him in the cellar, but I think they have a chance to rise a little bit here.
And I certainly don't think that this team is going to be in the cellar. As a matter of fact, this team won a game in the NCAA tournament, but it's going to be looking a little bit different this year for Duquesne, a team that really hung their head on defense. They had Keith Dambrot as their coach. He decided to retire after that NCAA tournament run, and Drew Joyce III, who played with LeBron James in high school, comes in and he retained a few guys. Kareem Rozier is going to be back after he was able to offer about 2.5 assists, solid 3-point shooter. They bring in a double-figure scorer in Trey Dinkins, who is very rock solid in the Metro Atlantic. Alex Williams is someone that comes in from Furman, nearly a 40% 3-point shooter. How do you look at a Duquesne team that might have a little bit of a different identity, but certainly brings in quite a bit of firepower via the portal?
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see the transition with Drew Joyce, a guy that I think a lot of people really have felt strongly about for a long time, is being deserving of a head coaching job, high motor in recruiting. And I think you saw that in the spring with what they did in the portal. I think Jakob Netjes, who had a big year, especially down the stretch as a freshman, was really a big part of that run late in the year that led them to an NCAA tournament and an NCAA tournament win at that. I think he has a chance to really break through. I think the other guy that's really important for them is Jay Sean Corbett at Chicago State. 6'7", athletic, ability to put the ball on the floor, really, really talented. But can he play in structure? To me, that is the real question. Those games that Chicago State played were often kind of so ragtag. Him and Wesley Cardet were given a ton of freedom of just, hey, go do whatever you want. And I think it'll be fascinating to see how he transitions into a more defined role. But I think the two of them give Duquesne some really interesting, bigger wing talent to go with Dinkins and Edwards in the backcourt. And it's a pretty scary combination.
Yep, I think so as well. As joining me on the show, we've got Kevin Sweeney, who does such great work over at SI Now, joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, and it's going to be interesting to see what we get out of this team, as Rhode Island, first few years under Archie Miller, have not necessarily gone as planned. They are going to be bringing back David Green after he busted through towards back half of the season last year. Jaden House, one of their top scorers in the backcourt, he's going to be back as well. And I find it very interesting that Sebastian Thomas began his career at Rhode Island, didn't get a ton of minutes, goes to Albany, absolutely tears it up. Now he's back for his second go-around with Rhode Island. They do bring back quite a bit of talent from last year, but I think the big question is, how much of a step forward can this talent take under a guy in Archie Miller that has proven it in the Atlantic 10, but last few seasons, both at Rhode Island and Indiana, things have come into question with him a little bit more.
Just collapses down the stretch each of the last 2 years at URI. Just some non-competitive performances really in February. And I think that's concerning, especially when you bring a lot of these guys back. I think Archie hopes that they have what it takes to take the next step. I do think they have the talent. I think Jamarcus Lawrence helps them, Nebraska transfer, a guy who can defend multiple positions, make a shot. Thomas should give them better point guard play than they had last year with Louis Courtwright. Hopefully a healthy front court with David Green and David Fuchs. I mean, again, there's a lot here. I would even circle, some of the guys that they brought in from the portal off the bench, like Teresa Traore and Quentin DeBouge. They have legit positional size. They have athleticism. They're an older team, really, with the exception of Fuchs and Cam Estevez. I think there's a lot of reasons for cautious optimism with URI, and especially with their non-conference schedule, which is very weak. I think the expectation needs to be that you win 20 games and are in the top half of the league. And if not, I think you've started to have questions about, where this thing is going under Archie Miller at URI.
Yeah, since that NCAA tournament game against Trae Young in Oklahoma, it has not been great for URI over the last few seasons, but things have been rock solid for Richmond. They go 15-3 in Atlantic 10 play last year, and really it wasn't because they did anything amazing. It's what they didn't do. They were in the top 5 nationally in fewest turnovers on a per possession basis. Problem is they are going to be losing their top four scorers with Delaney Hunt really being the main guy that returns along Jason Roche. They do bring in B. Artist White from the portal, double figure scorer in the MAC, and Jonathan Beagle is someone that I like down low along Dusan Niskovich. How do you take a look at a bunch in Richmond that they really didn't do anything amazing other than not beat themselves, but now they have to replace a lot of that, shall we say, fulcrum from a season ago?
Yeah, I mean, look, Jordan King was unreal last year. Like shot making, 84 threes at 41%. Like was a very deserving contender for A10 player of the year along with Jaron Holmes. And that says a whole heck of a lot about how good he was. Look, I think Beagle is a good fit in the Richmond offense. He's that kind of traditional Richmond big, can pass a little bit, handle the ball. Really the guard play is the question. Hunt was not great to me a year ago. Bring in, B. Artist White, who inefficient volume guy. George Washington the third, a Michigan transfer, another guy who really made his mark in the AAU level as kind of a volume scorer. Dusan Neskovich didn't win at Dartmouth, was really just a volume scorer. Like they have really stacked up these guys who had reputations, at least, as being sort of inefficient chuckers and hoping that they can, fix them in this system. Now, to their credit, Jordan King was kind of perceived as an inefficient chucker when he got there. So maybe some faith should be had in Chris Mooney to figure it out. That being said, it is a lot to lose, not just Quinn and King, but I think the loss of John and Bailey is massive. Like, he was such a good glue guy. It's going to really hurt them defensively. I do see this team taking a pretty big step back. Again, wouldn't totally bet the house against them given Mooney's track record as a coach, but this to me looks more like a rebuild than anything else.
I think that this one is going to be a little bit of a rebuild as well, as I absolutely love what Dr. Schmidt is able to do, but over at St. Bonaventure, they have to replace each of last year's top six scorers. They're going to be, without question, looking to Chance Moore to be able to elevate the team after he was a double-figure scorer over at Missouri State. And Melvin Council led Wagner and darn near everything from last season. I think that that's actually a great fit for them. I think a big X factor is the junior college transfer from Barton and Lajay Jones, who literally stuffed the statue, JUCOrecruiting.com. I know had him as the top 10 guy, but how do you look at a St. Bonaventure team that for the second time in 3 years, pretty much everything is brand spanking new for them?
Yeah, I mean, really hard to do what they've done in terms of flipping a roster and be competitive again. I will say Chance Moore should be a good piece. I really like Melvin Council. I think he is a really dynamic guard, athletically, ability to get to the rim. They played North Carolina in the NCAA tournament when he was at Wagner last year. And you watch that game, and usually you watch a 116 game. There's nobody on the floor for that 16 seed where you think, oh, he could play. He could sniff the floor for the 1 seed. And it sort of felt like Melvin Council could sniff the floor. He is really, really good. I think he helps them a lot. One guy to circle, the French kid, Noah Bolanga. He is, I believe, 21 years old, has a pretty significant track record of overseas production. Another one of these guys that is coming over with maybe more pedigree than your average international freshman, if you will. So he'd be a guy I circle. If Bonaventure is able to exceed expectations, I think he will be a big reason why.
Yeah, but I think that there's quite a few interesting pieces for the Bonnies, and Noel Brown, I think, is going to be a little bit of a piece to watch for, as well as Kevin Sweeney, who does such great work over at SI Now in the Field of 68, joining me right here for the Atlantic 10 Conference Preview Edition on Coast to Coast Hoops. And this team, I think, is so interesting because I love Frank Dunphy as a coach, but now LaSalle, they have to replace four of their top five scorers with Deshaun Shepard really being the main guy that returns. Tunde Valberg Fasasi, hopefully I got that correctly, along with Andres Marrero. They're going to be returning as well. They're the only two players other than really Shepard that averaged more than 3.5 points per contest a season ago. But I love the fact that they bring in Jaleel White, a double-figure scorer over at Temple. He should be able to help out. Corey McKeithen should be able to help out as well. And Mac ATN, I think, is just an X factor because he was a former top 50 recruit. But how do you evaluate a LaSalle team that you know is going to be well coached? But I look at the players on paper and not necessarily a team that strikes fear into anyone.
Yeah, I think the calling card's going to have to be defense here. As you said, Dunphy's a really good coach. He's found them a level of respectability that they didn't have under Ash Howard. And Shepard is a monster defender to kind of anchor things. Jaleel White, 6'7", very athletic, guard multiple spots. Fasasi, another guy you mentioned, great length. I think Demetrius Lilly, the transfer from Penn State, gives them some real girth on the interior, physicality. So points are going to be hard to come by for them. They have to hope that they're hard to come by for their opponents. And that's, I think, their path to being competitive here this year. Otherwise, I think it'll be tough just to lose Brickus and Khalil Brantley, especially two really, really dynamic shot-making guards.
Yep, no question about it. It's going to be tough for them, and it's going to be tough for UMass to replace their top two rebounders as well as they had a good thing going on with Matt Cross along Josh Cohen last season. But they are going to be bringing back Russell Diggins, double-figure scorer, was able to shoot about 37% from three-point range. And Frank Martin is another one of those coaches that does a great job preaching defense. Now, team was top 20 in the country in terms of percentage of missed shots that resulted in an offensive rebound. So Daniel Hankins Sanford, he's really going to need to step it up down low. Jalen Curry is going to be back as well. How do you take a look at a bunch that I thought that they might do a little bit more in the transfer portal, but I feel like Akil Watson, a former top 150 recruit, could be a little bit of a wild card for them.
I think so much of it really comes down to this backcourt with Jalen Curry and Rasul Diggins. Curry was up and down last year, but the highs were really high. He is a big time shot maker. Just has that shiftiness and quick twitch nature that I think you love when you're looking at, scoring combos. Diggins as well, coming back. You're I think 3 now in the system. He was a double figure guy by the end of last year and a guy that, can be explosive, especially without Cross and without as much of a post presence. I know Hank Sanford's there. And you also mentioned, I believe, Daniel Rivera, who's coming from Bryant. He will help them, be like that undersized big in post and score. But they're going to need their guards to really carry it. That to me is the big question is how big a jump is Curry ready for? If the one other thing with UMass to watch is, defensively, losing Keon Thompson on the ball is probably being underrated. He is a physical grinder. He was the head of the snake, and I think that will hurt them. If so much Frank Martin's teams is about kind of toughness and defense, and they were very good last year defensively, despite having Cohen back there, who's not a great defender. I do worry now with the way this group is constructed, if they won't be quite as good on that end, even with, Jaden Jenge, who I think is one of the better defenders, especially on the wing in the Atlantic 10.
Yep, the effort is certainly going to be there, but man, losing those two guys down low, that is going to be relatively rough. And it's going to be a little bit rough for Loyola Chicago to have to move on from some of those backcourt pieces like Braden Norris. But this is a team that you know very well as you are out there in the city of Chicago. And I love the fact that they bring in Francis Nworke, hopefully you got that correctly, who was over at UC San Diego last year, 11.5 points, 5.5 boards, career 37% three-point shooter. Love what he brings to this team. They didn't have a single guy, by the way, that averaged north of 5 rebounds per game. And yet, once again, they were one of the best teams in terms of defensive rebound rate. As a matter of fact, 26th or better in 5 out of the last 6 seasons in defensive rebound rate. They bring back Sheldon Edwards. I look at this bunch, and especially Justin Moore coming in, and they lose some pieces in the backcourt. I think that it's nice to feel optimistic about the fact that Desmond Watson is back, and I think that overall, this team should once again be able to lock it down on the defensive glass.
Yeah, I mean, Loyola was, I believe, from Christmas on last year, a top 10 defense in the country per Torvik, and they should be better defensively this year. They're more athletic. They replaced Braden Norris with, quick twitch athletic guards like Justin Moore, Kamani Winsu from Washington State. And Miles Rubin is maybe the best rim protector in college basketball. When he was on the floor last year, Loyola had the best 2-point defense in the country. When Dame Adelican, his backup, was on the floor, they were 333rd in rim defense. So a snapshot of his impact, he has a chance to really explode. This team is again, uber athletic, very, very talented, probably the most talent Drew Valentine has had at Loyola. The question is, can they score in the half court? They weren't super efficient offensively last year. Now they lose their point guard and probably their best individual playmaker in Phil Alston. That to me is the challenge. Is without Norris and without Phil, how do they produce in the half court? And do they win in close games? I mean, last year, that team was really good, but they also were really, really good in close games. With a new point guard and new faces around, are they as stable and rock solid in those big moments? That to me decides this team's ceiling. But the floor is really high because of what they can do defensively.
No doubt about it. I do think that there's going to be a lot of great defense being played. They're going to do a solid job on glass. Might lose a little bit from three-point range, but Desmond Watson coming back, I think, is big as well. And I do think that it is big that Fordham does return 2 of their better scorers from last season. Abdul Sambilia was really good for them down low. Will Richardson, double-figure score for a team that under Keith Ergo, they really didn't have that go-to guy last year. And I do like the fact that they bring in Jackie Johnson III, someone who was pretty successful in the beginning part of his career over at Duquesne, had some rock-solid seasons over at UNLV. Romad Dean is someone that at 6'7" is intriguing. And Matt Zona out of Notre Dame, I think, is a fascinating team as well. Ergo can clearly coach. I think the talent level is a little bit in question, and for Fordham, it's all about just being able to get some offensive production, in my opinion, because defense with this team is fine. The offense really let them down last year.
Yeah, they play really hard, and Simbila is an elite rim protector. Probably up there with Rubin among the best in the country. They'll miss Kyle Rose quite a bit defensively, and I think they'll also miss Antrell Charleston, who was a really good kind of Swiss Army knife piece. I worry with this group just sort of collecting these low efficiency volume scoring guards. You mentioned Richardson, Jafet Meador is back, and then Jackie Johnson. And this was a team that was 266 in offense last year and is putting the ball in the hands of really three guys in Richardson, Meador, and Jackie Johnson, who are sub 100 offensive rating guys, and are losing two of your more efficient offensive players in Rose and Charlton. That to me would be the primary concern. Just can they find a way to put the ball in the basket? And if they can be efficient, they're going to climb the ladder. But I worry that this thing slips because I just don't know how they score the ball efficiently.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. The defense is going to be there for Fordham, but that offense, man, it's been relatively rough for them over the last few seasons. But I do think that it is going to be there for this team. And joining me on the show, we do have Kevin Sweeney, who does great work over at the Field of 68, along with that SI now right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And George Mason, I love what they showed me in season number 1 under Tony Skinn. And I feel like KD Johnson is one of the most underrated guys that have come in the transfer portal all offseason. A former double-figure scorer over at Auburn and Georgia, a guy that saw significant minutes in the SEC. In my opinion, should be able to elevate this offense. Zach Anderson is a 6'7" combo player that's able to pop it from three. That comes in from the Florida Gulf Coast. Would like to see a little bit more out of Woody Newton, but Giovanni Amaruju coming in from Siena, he should be able to help out a little bit down low. They bring back Darius Maddox. They've got Jalen Haynes this year as well. I look at this George Mason team, and in my opinion, this team should be fighting towards the top of the Atlantic 10.
Maybe I'm a little lower than you. I do think they'll be good. I worry about KD Johnson as sort of the leader of your team. He's just such an emotional player. I think he probably got a bad rap at Auburn just because it was not all his fault. But I just think he runs so hot and cold that if he's the guy that is your point guard, has the ball in his hands, if he's your heartbeat, it's going to go fast sometimes, it's going to go slow. I don't love that in terms of trying to compete for a league championship. They can beat anyone in the league any given night. I worry they could lose to anyone in the league in any given night. And I will say, I think that the Jalen Haynes addition off the sit-out year for this two-time transfer is really valuable. I think he will help a lot. As a big, you can throw the ball to and score on the block. Zach Anderson shooting the basketball will help them. Maddox is a veteran nature as well as Jared Billups. Like, they have a lot of pieces, but that point guard spot with Johnson, who really is more of a scoring guard and is sort of inconsistent to begin with, that to me is really the main question here.
Yep, I do think that there's quite a few questions with them, and I do think that there might be a few questions with how everything is going to fit in, but my goodness, the talent is certainly there with Dayton. You bring in Posh Alexander, a double-figure scorer, the last 3 to 4 years to the Big East, a guy that's one of the best in all of college basketball at being able to generate turnovers. Team him up with bringing back Nate Santos, that's big. They do lose J-Ron Holmes, who was one of the better players that we've seen in the Atlantic 10 this decade, but having Malachi Smith back after he was limited just one game due to injury is big. You bring in Zed Key, a guy that has put up big numbers over at Ohio State. And for me, in my opinion, it should be Dayton and VCU really fighting it out for this conference, because with Dayton, I really love what they brought in the transfer portal.
Posh and Zed Key should really raise the floor here. I mean, that's two proven high major rotation players to go with Santos and Enoch Cheeks and Javon Bennett, all of whom proved they could play in the Atlantic 10 to begin with last year, right? So floor extremely high. Ceiling, that's really, I think, my question. I think part of it's Malachi Smith's health. Is he back to 100%? If he is, how does he share the floor with Posh? Like, Posh and Javon Bennett, and really Posh and Malachi Smith are an interesting pairing because you don't really want Posh playing off the ball, but you also can't play Javon Bennett off the ball. And Malachi Smith, his greatest asset is his ability to play in ball screen. So that to me is sort of a question. I also will say that I think a lot of these role players for Dayton looked better last year because they were surrounded by Deron Holmes, who attracted so much attention. I'm not sure Zed Key is going to be like that. I think Zed Key is a good starter in this league. I'm not convinced that he is a guy that you're going to have to really, really circle on the scouting report in the same way you did with Deron. So that to me would be my concern, but it's quite a collection of talent. And that's not even mentioning, some of the guys they brought in late, Ahmad Musa from NBA Academy and Armel Leotang from the French Spars League, two really good young talents, guys with significant futures ahead of them. Ahmad Musa, a guy that a lot of people at the Basketball Without Borders camp in February think could be an NBA player. Like, that's a guy that I think is right now the eighth man at Dayton. That's a good illustration of their talent level right now.
Yep, I do think that there is quite a bit of talent over there at Dayton. Once again, how it all meshes, that is going to be a little bit of a question mark, but they do, in my opinion, on paper, have a team that should be able to compete for an NCAA tournament spot. Question is whether or not it comes together. And for George Washington, early on last year, it looked like it was coming together, but top heavy team, they had a few injuries, and then things went straight down the toilet bowl. And now they look to pick up the pieces as Jared Buchanan Jr. is going to be back for this bunch, along Garrett Johnson, pair of guys that were nice double figure scorers, and JaQuoy Hutchinson, I think, is a little bit of a nice X factor as well. Like the fact that they bring in Gerald Drumgoole, began his career at Pittsburgh, nice double figure score over at Albany along with Delaware. So I do think that there's a little bit of upside, but I had this question with George Washington last year, and it's the same question I have this year. Is the depth going to be there to where if Garrett Johnson, Buchanan, one of these guys go out of the lineup, does it just completely torpedo the team?
Yeah, I mean, and look, they've already faced that. Garrett Johnson tore his ACL over the summer. He's not there for this season, which is just, again, a crushing blow. He's so good. Missed 2 years of Princeton with injuries, had a tumor on his hip that was dealt with. Like, this kid has been through everything. And so for an ACL to come like that, just after his first truly healthy season, just brutal and does hurt their team quite a bit. I do think Buchanan has a chance to be one of the best players in the league. I think they have a nice mix of these younger, talented guards like Hutchinson, Trey Autry with veterans like Trey Moss and Drumgoole. And then I think they solidified their front court with grad transfers. Rafael Castro from Providence and Sean Hansen from Cornell, two kind of competing skill sets. Castro run and jump big, and Hansen a pick and pop guy. I think the talent level has incrementally increased, but man, that Johnson injury just a killer.
Oh, yeah. Like with Garrett Johnson being out, I was prepared to put George Washington, if he was fully healthy, more towards like that middle of the conference, and can't do that with him being out. Drumgoole should be a help out, but man, that is very devastating. And what might be devastating to the rest of the conference is what St. Louis might be able to do this year. They bring in Josh Schertz. He brings with him Robbie Avila along with Isaiah Swope. No doubt about it. I'm sure they would have liked to bring in a little bit more from Indiana State, but getting in two of the top three scorers, good place to start. And I think that Gibson Jimerson is going to be a perfect fit for Josh Schertz, a guy that's able to pop it from three, has really ideal size. They bring in Kobe Johnson from West Virginia. Kalu Anya is someone I like at Brown at 6'8", good rebounder, a guy that's able to pop it from three. AJ Casey's a little bit of an upside guy from Miami. I look at the St. Louis bunch, and it might take a little bit of time to be able to gain that chemistry, but that's a team that I envision being a team that might struggle early and really pick up steam late.
Yeah, I mean, Josh Schertz, phenomenal offensive coach, and the hub of that group is back, obviously, with Robbie. And it sucks to lose Conwell. It sucks to lose Jason Kent, who was such an important piece defensively for them. But Robbie is the head of the snake. That was critical to have him back, or I guess, given it's a new school. Jimerson's fit in the system is ideal. Really, questions to me are the point and then the four. I know that they're very excited about Josiah Dotzler, transfer from Creighton. He was a guy that was on a loaded MoCan team in AAU, a guy that I think Schertz recruited to Indiana State and couldn't get because Creighton jumped in late. He will be an interesting guy to watch, him versus Kobe Johnson for that point guard spot. And then at the four, you mentioned Casey and Kaluanya. Who can kind of jump into that? Who can jump into that role similar to what Jason Kent played a year ago defensively, high IQ, quick processor? I mean, that's really the biggest thing with the Schertz system is guys need to be able to think the game and make quick decisions. And so that will be the adjustment, I think, for both Casey and Anya is how do they adjust to that type of a role?
Yep, I think that is going to be a little bit of a question. And if there's a team that, in my opinion, doesn't have as many questions when it comes to the Atlantic 10, that's VCU, because you bring back your top three scorers, Zeb Jackson, Joe Bezmili, along with Max Shulga, Jack Clark, who it feels like is the Van Wilder of college basketball. Began his career in the conference, was playing over at NC State, was playing over at Clemson. Now here he is at VCU. So just all around the world for him, but also bringing in Philip Russell, a nice double-figure scorer over at UT Arlington. Ryan Odom did a great job with VCU in year number one, despite a bunch of injuries. And if he can even get a little bit of better luck on the health front, I do think that VCU is going to be right there towards the top of the conference.
Yeah, I mean, guard play is phenomenal. That makes them my pick to win the league, just because to have four guards of the caliber of Zeb Jackson, Max Shulga, Philip Russell, and Joe Bamasiel is really hard to come by at the mid-major level. Again, much credit to them for pulling that off. I will say, they were very, very good defensively a year ago, and I think a lot of that had to do with sort of merging the old and the new. To have Toby Lawal, for instance, back there as a rim protector was big. They had athleticism and length that I think they won't quite have as much of this year. So I think that'll be an interesting question is how do they balance that? but I think Furman at the 5 will be solid. I also think you can circle Martin Carrere, the French kid that they brought in late as kind of a wing shooter type. Him and Michael Bell, like upside galore. They need one of those guys to break out and really help them this year. But to me, the favorite in the league.
Yep, I think so as well. And we've got one team left to take a look at, and that'd be St. Joe's. St. Joe's, one of the more interesting teams in this conference because they're another team that, much like VCU, they bring back so much from last year. That backcourt of Xavier Brown, Eric Reynolds II, they're going to be sticking together. But Derek Simpson coming in for Rutgers is a nice find. Justice Ajabor, he was over at Harvard. Nice 6'10" double-figure scorer is nice. And then Steve Solano, the 6'11" freshman, I think is one of the more slept-on freshmen at really the non-power conference level in all of college basketball. Billy Lang has been able to get the team's win total to be able to climb every single year, and I don't see why that trend slows down here because of everything that they bring back.
No excuses this year to have the talent of, I mean, everybody talks about Reynolds, but Xavier Brown to me is like a high level player. Like that is a guy that can play in the NBA one day. And so you have him, Reynolds, and Rasheer Fleming. I mean, no excuses. Like this team should be the favorite to win the Atlantic 10, and the fact that they aren't, I think, is illustrating kind of the questions that people have about Billy Lang. Now, talent-wise, you'll love them. My 2 questions are, number 1, paint touches. Lynn Greer last year was, their best defensive guard and the guy that they could rely on to consistently get into the paint and spray it out to Brown and Reynolds as shooters. Derek Simpson is not that guy. Much different player. I like Derek Simpson a lot. He's very talented. He's a ball-in-hand guard. He's someone who wants to go create and make tough shots. Again, kind of similar to what Reynolds and Brown do. That, to me, would be my first concern. And then at the 5 spot, last year you had Chris DeSandico, who's at Providence now, who had elite size, but was also a guy you could play through in like the DHO game. So again, put defenses in binds when they're trying to guard Reynolds and Brown. You're not going to be able to do it with Achabar. He has zero skill offensively. Now, he should help them a lot defensively at the rim. Elite rim protector when he can stay on the floor. He has had issues with health. But to me, that would be the question is life a little bit more difficult for Reynolds and for Brown without the paint touch guard and without the big that can pass? That can hold this group back. But talent-wise, again, high level for this league and really for any mid-major.
Yep, it is a very high level of talent. They've got a lot that is coming back, but their talent level does not match that of yours, Kevin. You do such great work over at Sports Illustrated. You do amazing work over at the Field of 68. You're taking a look at all 364 Division I teams, so let the good people at home know what's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Yeah, I mean, just grinding away on preview stuff behind the scenes that we'll have out for you in October. Lots of fun stuff ahead. I mean, it's a fun time of year. 50-something days to the season, and looking forward to it. Thanks, Greg.
Absolutely. Kevin does such an amazing job taking a look at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball, and every single time he joins me, lends such great insight. So, big thanks, Kevin, for joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast, and coming next is that time of the podcast I give you my projector finish for the Atlantic 10. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Always great to be joined by Kevin Sweeney, who does such amazing work. Take a look at this amazing game of college basketball. Every single time he joins me, he lends such great insights on what is going to be a very fun conference out here in the Atlantic 10. It's going to be wild, crazy, and Kevin, much like myself, he is here for it, and he's evaluating all 364 D1 teams. So salute to him, and always great to get him aboard. Big thanks, Kevin, for joining me in the last segment. Now it is that time of the podcast to give you my projector finish for the Atlantic 10, and since I am doing a conference preview today, any news and notes that we saw in college basketball on Wednesday, those are going to be polished up on the podcast tomorrow, and I would say expect moving forward about one conference preview week, since after the Atlantic 10, I'll have 6 remaining. We'll have the American, the ACC, Big 10, Big 12, SEC, and also the Big East. So we've got those all on tap, and we've got on tap for deadlines of my projector finish Fordham. I do think that this is going to be a tough road for them, and I like Keith Ergo as a coach. The defense was relatively rock solid for this team, and they were 41st in the country in terms of points allowed on a per possession basis on the road, but man, they just need to improve the fact that this team was 353rd in home opponents' three-point shooting percentage, with opponents making 39% of their threes, despite the fact that their defense was so rock solid. They were 350th in fouls committed per defensive play, and they just didn't bring in as much by the transfer portal as I would have liked to have seen. You've got Roma Dean, who's able to give you about 33% three-point shooting with 5 points, 3.5 rebounds per game. Bringing back Will Richard and his nearly 10 points per game is nice. And Abdul Sambilia, he's going to be able to do a solid job down low. It's 2.3 blocks per game. That was in the top 25 nationally among qualifying Division I players, but you just don't have a lot of firepower with this team. I know that this was being alluded to by Kevin Sweeney, but I feel the same way. You've got a guy in Jackie Johnson who's able to give you scoring, but he is a little bit of a chucker. Now, we'll say that when he was over at Duquesne was more of a 37.5% three-point shooter, but offense is really going to be looking to run through him. Fordham, in my opinion, just doesn't have a ton of depth, and they've been looking to go a little bit more up-tempo under Ergo. I think that that's going to be disastrous. So I do have at number 15 in terms of my projector finish, Fordham. At number 14, I'm going with George Washington, and the biggest reason why I'm going with George Washington is that giant injury to Garrett Johnson. That is just absolutely disastrous for them, as Johnson was shooting over 40% from three with ideal size, 13 points, 5.5 rebounds per game. Now Darren Buchanan, who was already a do-it-all guy last season, 15.5 points, 6.5 boards, 2.5 assists, 1.3 steals per game. He now has to do even more with Maximus Edwards being out. I like Gerald Drumgoole. He last season over at Delaware was able to log about 14 points, 4 boards, 2.5 assists per game. Nice do-it-all sort of player. And Trey Moss, 13.5 points per game over at William & Mary. That's going to be able to help them out a little bit, but this team was not good defensively. They were 155th in the country in terms of points scored on a per possession basis. You just can't survive when you're not playing great defense, when you're playing offense like that as well. Rafael Castro, he comes in for Providence after he rode their bench at 6'9". This team is not going to have ideal rebounding. I do like Sean Hansen coming over from Cornell. He's about 6'9". He's able to pop it from three-point range, but again, this team just has very much a lack of depth. They're probably going to be running a six-man rotation once again. They really gave up the arc towards the back half of the season last year. George Washington was looking pretty solid in that beginning part of the season, and then things went just completely to mush, and they were 357th in turnovers force on a per possession basis. So that's a big issue. I've got George Washington as a result, number 14 in my projector finish. By the way, had Johnson not been out, they probably would have been in my top 10. So that's how big I feel like that injury is. At number 13, I'm going to be going with Davidson. For Davidson, the team is 31-33 in their 2 seasons under Matt McKillop, and they bring back a few nice pieces. A trio of guys in Connor Gachera, Reed Bailey, along with Bobby Durkin. These 3 guys, they were able to combine for about 32, 33 points per contest. Durkin, 4.5 boards and a steal per contest. And Joe Hurlbert, he comes over from Colorado. He was a guy that was really glued to the bench for them, but this team was 319th in three-point shooting percentage last season. Hunter Adam, he was able to give the team about 3 points per game off the bench, but you just don't have a lot of weapons for this team. Kachera was able to shoot about 36% from three-point range last season, and even though you do bring back 3 of your top 4 scorers from last season, I just don't feel like this team has the talent to really compete out there in the Atlantic 10, and I'm right now just have my question marks with Matt McKillop as a coach. His father and Bob McKillop was obviously rock solid, and he's got great bloodlines. He's going to be able to lean on him for a little bit of support, but I feel like just like players have to turn a little bit of a corner, coaches have to do so as well. Matt McKillop, in my opinion, just has not turned the corner yet, and I just don't think that he's got the depth or the firepower to be able to have this Davidson team competitive in the Atlantic 10. So as a result, I do have them at number 13 in terms of my projector finish. At number 12, I'm going to go with LaSalle. LaSalle really doesn't have a lot of talent on the roster, but I'm willing to trust in Frank Dunphy to be able to keep this team out of the cellar. You've got Tunde Vial-Fasasi, who is teaming up with Andres Marrero. These 2 guys, they were able to do a nice job combining for 14 points per contest. Marrero shot 39.5% from three-point range. Fasasi, he at 6'8", was able to drain about 35.5% of his threes, as this LaSalle team was actually rock solid in terms of their three-point shooting, and I feel like I've done a lot of conference previews where I'm like, hey, Mac Etienne is going to be a wild card. 6'10", gentleman that was rated by 247 Sports as the number 42 recruit in the class of 2020 did a big giant nothing burger over at DePaul, but I'm telling you, Matt KTN might be able to do something for this team. He finally, as a coach, didn't have that at DePaul last season. Over at UCLA, he was just buried behind a whole bunch of other guys, so I do think that there's upside there. And then you've got Deshaun Shepard. It was being alluded to by Kevin. This guy is a tremendous defender. He's right around 6'5", 6'6". He's able to cover multiple positions, 10.5 points, 5.5 rebounds per game. Not going to light it up from three-point range, but bringing in Corey McKeithen, who was able to loan out about 3.5 assists per contest in the Metro Atlantic. That's going to be rock solid as well. So I do take a look at this bunch, especially with Jaleel White coming over from Temple. 10 points, 5.5 boards, not going to drain threes, but got plenty of that. I do think that LaSalle has a little bit of upside. So I've got them at number 12 in terms of my projector finish. At number 11, I'm going with Rhode Island. I'm just really starting to sour on Archie Miller as a coach. Did great things over at Dayton in that Elite 8 run and so much more, but it did not go well for him at Indiana, and right now it's been a big giant stinkburger here at Rhode Island. But for Sebastian Thomas, just such an interesting spot for him. He, in 2 years at Rhode Island, averaged 4.5 points, 2.5 assists per game, goes to Albany and absolutely lights it on fire. 19.5 points, 4 boards, 4.9 assists, 1.9 steals per game, and now you've got a fully healthy David Green. Limited to 19 games last season, shot 43.5% from 3, 14 points per contest. David Fuchs, he's able to give you about 8 points, 6.5 rebounds per game. Cam Esteves, he was the only guy that returns a shot above 67.4% at the free throw line, and that's an issue. Rhode Island was absolutely terrible at the free throw line last season, 349th in all of college basketball, but in terms of Mr. Esteves, was able to give the team 7 points, shot 41.5% from 3-point range. Jamarcus Lawrence, coming in from Nebraska, part-time starter there, 7 points, 3 boards, 2.5 assists, lifetime 36.5% 3-point shooter, but lifetime 62% free throw shooter, should be able to elevate. You've also got Joseph Blau, who has been just limited to injury. He has played 17 games the last few seasons, so that's an issue. Actually, 14 games as Quentin DeBonge, who comes over from East Carolina. He was limited to 17 games last year, so you've got a lot of injury concerns. You've got upside, in my opinion, with this roster, but again, it's put up or shut up time for Rhode Island, and for Rhode Island, for the love of Pete, let's find a way to generate a turnover. 354th in the country in terms of turnovers forced on a per possession basis last season. So Rhode Island, my number 11 team in terms of my projector finish. At number 10, we're going with the Itsy Bitsy Spiders of Richmond. Richmond has to replace a whole heck of a lot from last year, including Jordan King, who was one of the most important players to like any team in college basketball last season. The name of the game was ball security for Richmond last year, third in the country in terms of fewest turnovers on a per possession basis, committing a turnover on just 12.6% of their possessions. And Lonnie Hunt is pretty much the only guy that returns that had north of 5 points per game last season. 9.5 points, 3 boards, 1.3 steals per contest, and a rock solid 38.5% 3-point shooter. B. Artis White is coming off of shooting 38.5% from 3 with 10.5 points, 3.2 boards, 3.2 assists per game over at Western Michigan last year, but Western Michigan was terrible. B. Artis White has been about as inconsistent as it gets in his college basketball career. Apollos Rumaglu, who he was a part of UConn last year, made 55.6% of his threes at UConn last year, but he averaged 1 point per game, and he did not see action in all of those games last year. So, very small sample size. Dusan Niskovich, though, he comes in from Dartmouth. He was able to average 16 points, 4 boards, and shot 36.5% from 3. He's a nice 6'8" sort of combo player. Felt like he was a good player that was just attached to a really, really bad Dartmouth team last season. This team was 14th in America in opponents' field goal shooting percentage. This team is very rock solid with Chris Mooney as their coach, and George Washington III, not to be confused with the other George Washington. He was a former top 150 recruit that was glued to the bench over at Michigan last season. I think that he's going to be rock solid as well. So Richmond, a lot of moving pieces. They have to replace pretty much 4 out of their top 5 scorers from the season ago, but I do think that Chris Mooney's still going to have these guys competitive. As a result, I do have Richmond at number 10 in terms of my projector finish. At number 9, I'm going to be going with St. Bonaventure. Dr. Schmidt has a whole lot to replace. He loses north of 90% of his scoring from a season ago, but I like what he's got coming in the transfer portal. I, much like Kevin Sweeney, very bullish on Melvin Council. He led the team in points, rebounds, assists, and blocks last year. 15 points, 5.7 rebounds, 3.5 assists, 1.4 steals for a team that was 296th in terms of possessions per game last year, he should be a textbook fit, as Wagner, always a super slow team, a team that likes to play a lot of defense. Noel Brown, he's the top scorer returning from last season. At 6'11", he only gave the team 2.2 rebounds per game. He needs to work on that, but 6 points per contest. But the kicker for this team, Lajee Jones. He comes in from Barton College. JUCOrecruiting.com rated him as the number 7 junior college transfer for the class of 2024. He was able to log for the team 15.5 points, 9 boards, 1.5 steals, 1.2 blocks, shot 42% from 3 as a 6'7" do-it-all sort of player. Michael Fullerin, hopefully I said that correctly. He comes in from Salt Lake Community College, began his career over at Eastern Washington. He should be able to give the team a little bit of size at 6'11". Jackson Edwards was a 7.5 point per game scorer that averaged a little bit over a block per contest over at Valparaiso. The 3-point shooting is going to be down for this team. After last year, they were 34th in the country in terms of 3-point shooting, but Deshaunte Bowen, coming over from Iowa, where he was able to give the team about a pair of assists, 4.5 points per game, he should be able to help out in the backcourt. So I do think that Dr. Schmidt going to be able to do his best with this roster. I've got them number 9 in terms of my projector or finish, and then at number 8, I'm going to be going with UMass. With UMass, they lose their 2 main rebounders from last season, and Josh Cohen along with Matt Cross, and that is going to be hurting them quite a bit, but they do bring back Rasul Diggins, was able to do a nice job, shooting about 36% from 3-point range, was able to give the team 13 points, 2.5 assists, a little bit over a steal per contest. I like Daniel Hankins-Sanford. He was able to chip in there about 5 boards per contest, and then I always have a tough time with this name, Jaden Nijunge. He was able to give you about 5 boards, 5.5 points, 2 assists, really a nice stat sheet stuff for him. Jalen Curry had a rock solid freshman year as well, 7.5 points, 2 assists per contest. Malik Agelwad, he comes in as a 6'10" big man from Murray State. He should be able to help out with size. And then Daniel Rivera at Bryant was a 6'6", just matrix, 8 boards, 13 points, 2.2 assists, a steal, and 2.2 blocks per contest. At 6'6", he was in the top 25 nationally in terms of blocks among qualifying Division I players. And then Akil Watson, he was just not able to get a lot of playing time over at Arizona State last season, but he stands right around 6'10", a former top 150 recruit according to 247 Sports. He should be able to come in. He should be able to fit that Frank Martin style right away. You don't have as much versatility with the big men, which does have me a little bit bearish. And for UMass, they were a team that very much relied upon second chances to be able to generate their offense top 15 in the country in terms of offensive rebound rate. But I do think that Frank Martin brought in some nice guys in the transfer portal, and that should be able to keep them in the middle of the conference. I've got UMass number 8 in terms of my projector finish. Now we get into decision time. Number 7 in my projector finish, I'm going to be going Duquesne. Duquesne was able to make the NCAA tournament and win a game because they were just oh so rock solid on defense, but now you lose Keith Dambrot and you lose a lot of heart and soul pieces from a season ago. Drew Joyce III, who actually played with LeBron James over at St. Vincent, I believe that it is, out there in Ohio for high school basketball. He was able to retain Kareem Rozier, who was able to chip in there about 5 points, 2.5 assists, 38% 3-point shooter, nice building block there, and then Maximus Edwards, who has a lot of familiarity within the conference. He was over at George Washington as a 6'6" wing last season. He comes in 12.5 points, 6.5 boards, shot 36% from 3-point range. Alex Williams, Trey Dinkins, these are 2 guys that combine for about 29 points per contest, with Dinkins over at Canisius last season, Williams over at Furman last season. Both of these guys north of 36% 3-point shooters. Feels like this team is really going to be going bombs away from 3. And now you've got David Dixon back in the fold after you average a block and a half, 4.8 rebounds per game, a key reserve from last season. And Jay-Sean Corbett should be able to help out a little bit down low as well. This is going to help elevate a team that was 53rd in the country in terms of turnovers forced on a per possession basis. And I do think that with Duquesne, they're going to take a little bit of step back. It's going to take a little bit of time to get used to that Drew Joyce style, but I do think that he's going to be able to keep the Dukes relatively competitive out here in the Atlantic 10 and be able to keep a lot of that identity that you saw last year with perhaps a little bit more 3-point shooting. So do have Duquesne at number 7 in terms of my projector or finish. At number 6, I'm going with St. Louis. With St. Louis, I think that this is going to be a team that struggles early and then is able to surge late, as you do have a lot of moving parts and you're going to have a different style from what a lot of these guys that are staying are used to, as there are a few guys that are staying from the Travis Ford regime. That includes the top scorer from last season in Gibson Jimerson, who is very rock solid. I think that he fits his style perfectly. 16 points, 4.5 boards, shot 42.5% from 3-point range last season, and Larry Hughes is second. Yeah, makes you feel old when you say a name like that. He's back after averaging about 7.5 points, a little bit over a steal per contest, and Kellen Thomas, he was able to shoot about 36% for 3-point range, like 6 points per contest, and I do like what Kobe Johnson brings to the table. Last year at West Virginia was a starter with a little bit over 2 assists, 6 points per game. Not a guy that's going to go into takeover mode, but AJ Casey, he's a 6'9" big man, comes in from Miami, former top 150 recruit. That should be able to help out a little bit down low along Kalu Enya, who is over at Brown. He was able to chip in there 9.5 points, 7.5 boards. Smart kid, obviously, at 6'8", able to pop in from 3-point range, but let's call it what it is. The big ticket items, that's Robbie Avila, Isaiah Swope. These two guys, while they were at Indiana State last year, combined for about 33.5 points per contest. Avila at 6'10", shot 39% from 3-point range. Swope chipped in there a little bit over a seal. He was able to shoot in the high 30s from 3-point range. Schertz brings a high-octane offense that was 11th in 3-point shooting percentage last year, was in the top 10 nationally in terms of points scored on a per-possession basis. I think that's going to take a little bit of time, and though I have St. Louis at number 6 in my projector of finish, I could see a scenario where St. Louis is playing like the number 10, number 11 team early on, and then they're playing like a top 4 team going into that Atlantic 10 tournament. So, do have St. Louis as a result. Number 6 in terms of my projector of finish. At number 5, I'm going with St. Joe's. With St. Joe's, it's sort of a need to see it to believe it sort of scenario because you've got some nice returning pieces. I like Eric Reynolds, 17 points, a little bit of a steal, shot 38% from 3-point range last season, and Xavier Brown, he was able to notch 12 points, 4.5 boards, 3.5 assists, 1.8 steals, shot over 40% from 3-point range. Rasheer Fleming, he's back after he was able to give the team about 7.5 boards, 10.5 points, a block and a half per contest, and he was able to shoot it well from 3-point range, but you do lose one of your main men from down low, 7-footer and Craig Edasonko. Hopefully I said that correctly. You replace him with Justice Ajabar, who was over at Harvard last season. He was able to log 2.9 point blocks per contest. That was in the top 5 nationally among qualifying D1 players. Derek Simpson, he's looking to elevate the team after he at Rutgers averaged about a steal and a half, 3 assists, 8.5 points per game. Here's the question with Simpson, though. Can he help out the offense? Because at Rutgers, they were tremendous on defense, and you know that you're going to be able to get that out of him. Offense was absolutely putrid. Under Billy Lang, the team has had their win total improve in each out of the last 4 seasons. They also bring in a guy that I really like in Steve Solano, a top 250 recruit. I feel like he at 6'11" is going to be able to add quite a bit down low, but still have my question marks with the St. Joe's team. It feels like they have a few mental brain cramps at the end of games, and I do fear that Billy Lang might get a little bit out-coached in some of these games. So, as a result, I do have St. Joe's at number 5 in my projector of finish. At number 4, I'm going with Loyola Chicago. Loyola Chicago has a tried-and-true system. They are not going to let you get second chances. 26 or better in defensive rebound rate, 5 out of the last 6 seasons. You've got Francis Nworke, who comes in from UC San Diego, 11.5 points, 5.5 boards, career 37% 3-point shooter at 6'7". He's able to guard multiple positions. Miles Rubin, as a freshman, was rock solid down low, 2.3 blocks, 4.5 boards, 6.2 points per game. And I mentioned that I had said about the defensive rebound rate. They did that with Rubin at 4.7 rebounds per game, being their top rebounder. Everyone rebounds, everyone plays defense on this team. For Loyola Chicago, they were one of the best defensive teams in all of college basketball. After the turn of the calendar, they bring in Justin Moore, who's going to be able to give you more. Over at Drexel last season, 12.5 points, 3.5 boards, 3.5 assists, 1.1 steals per contest. And Desmond Watson, top scorer, 12.5 points per game, 2.5 assists. He's back after shooting 38.5% from 3-point range last season. Jaden Dawson, he's able to shoot 37% from 3-point range. Though you lose the likes of Braden Norris in the backcourt, it does feel like this team should be a little bit more efficient on offense. Some of the guys that they lost, in my opinion, just were a little bit too turnover happy. We saw that 2 seasons ago, and I feel like Mr. Valentine is coming into his own as a coach after 2 seasons ago with Drew Valentine. You could tell that perhaps the moment was a little bit too big for him, taking over at Loyola Chicago with a little bit of turnover with the roster. Feels like he's really been able to put his stamp on the program now. Team is going to need to improve their 68% free throw shooting. That was 315th in the country, but I do think that the guys that they have brought in going to be able to do so. I got Loyola Chicago number 4 in terms of my projector finish. And number 3, we're going with George Mason. Absolutely love the fact that Tony Skinn took over this program. You may recall he was the guy that very nearly got George Mason kicked out of the NCAA tournament in 2006. He's a guy that in the CAA tournament, he had the punch to the gentleman in the private area. That was not great to say the least, but he atoned for that, was part of that George Mason team that made the Final Four, and he decided that the Patriots were going to slow down last year. 345th in total possessions per game. Bringing back Darius Maddox, I think, is big. Shot over 40% from three-point range, was able to log for the team a little bit over 14 points per contest. Jared Billups, he was a fellow starter that was able to help out a team that was 37th in the country in terms of rebound rate. He put up about 4.5 points, 4.5 rebounds per game, and I think that's so big that you've got Jalen Haynes, who is back as well. Haynes missed the entirety of the 2023-24 season after he was able to log 14.5 points, 6.5 boards over at East Tennessee State. Zach Anderson at 6'7" was a 45.9% three-point shooter, 26th among qualifying D1 players, and perhaps I'm just a little bit too bullish on this guy, but love what KD Johnson is able to bring to the table. During the 2020-21 season as a freshman over at Georgia, 13.5 points, 1.8 steals, shot 38.5% from three-point range. Now, seeing his points per game total dip in each season ever since then, going down to about 7.1 points per game at Auburn, but this is a guy that has put up massive numbers in the SEC. Jeremiah Quigley is someone that comes over from Iona, 10.5 points, 3.5 boards, 3.5 assists per contest. Giovanni Amaruju over at Siena last year was able to chip in there north of 6 boards per contest. Woody Newton is a 6'8", 6'9", little bit of a gadget guy that's able to pop some threes. He's able to give you some rebounds, and this team was 12th in the country in opponents' 2-point shooting percentage. They are tough. Number 3 in my projector finish, going with George Mason. At number 2, I'm going to be going with Dayton. And the reason why I've got Dayton at number 2 instead of number 1, because I think that the Dayton Flyers are the most talented team in this conference, but I think it might take a little bit of time getting used to Posh Alexander, who was able to log 11.5 points, 4.7 assists, 2.3 steals per contest as a starter in the Big East each of the last 4 seasons. And Zed Key has been a rock-solid player in the Big Ten over the last few seasons. Had a little bit of a dip last year, 6.5 points, 4.1 rebounds per game, but he averaged 10.8 points, 7.5 boards, and a block per contest 2 seasons ago. Pairs very well with Nate Santos. Santos, he, over at Dayton last season, 11.5 points, 6.5 boards, and right around about 6'7". Let it fly at nearly 42% from three-point range, but losing Dayron Holmes is big. Enoch Cheeks is a little bit of a Swiss Army knife guy at 6'3". He's going to give you some boards. He's going to give you 8.5 points. He's going to dole it out. And Malachi Smith coming back after he was able to log about 5.5 assists per game in his last healthy season a few seasons ago, shot 39% from three-point range. That's going to be big for a team that they love to slow it down as well. 346th in terms of total possessions per game, 25th in terms of points scored on a per possession basis last year. One of the best three-point shooting teams in all of college basketball, but a little bit of a different look for them without Posh Alexander running the show, so that's why I've got them number 2 in my projector or finish. And at number 1, I'm going with VCU. VCU has won at least 18 games in 23 consecutive years. And we know how many coaches they've had to replace because everyone that takes this job goes up to a better level. Like, it's just absolutely insane what VCU has been able to develop. And now they're bringing back their top 3 scorers. Max Shulga, 14 points, 4.5 boards, 3.5 assists, 41.5% three-point shooter. And oh, by the way, for Shulga, shot 87.5% at the free throw line for a team that shot as a collective 78.1% at the free throw line, 14th in all of college basketball. In these closeout games, that is going to matter. Joe Besmealy, who's back, he was able to log about 13 points per game, spent a little bit of time at Oklahoma, has been for much of his career out there in the Atlantic 10, but 37% three-point shooter. Zeb Jackson, who began his career over at Michigan, he's able to do a little bit of everything. 1.4 steals, 4.5 boards, 3.3 assists, 11.5 points per game, and now you bring it together with UT Arlington transfer Philip Russell entering after he shot 38% from distance, 4.5 assists, 15 points per game. That is a nasty backcourt, and now you've got Jack Clark to be able to really lend a lot of versatility down low as well. He's now about 6'9", 6'10". He's a Van Wilder of college basketball, and that he has played darn near everywhere, but that said, he's coming off of averaging 4.7 points and 4.9 rebounds per game at Clemson last season. Had a good year 2 years ago at NC State. 9.7 boards, 1.7 steals per contest. Christian Fermin down low was able to give the team 1.4 blocks per contest as well. For VCU, they're another team that's really looking to slow it down, but Alonzo Billups being able to shoot 40% from three-point range, I think gives this team that great balance. Even though they do lose 1 or 2 pieces like Toby Lowell from a season ago, I think that bringing in Jack Clark is a big upgrade there. I think that VCU is going to do a solid job on glass. I do think that VCU just runs really good offense. I think that they're going to be a little bit more put together towards the beginning part of the season than Dayton, who's got a little bit more turnover. Then that's why I've got VCU number 1 in my projector finish for the Atlantic 10, and that will wrap things up for the Atlantic 10 Conference Preview Edition right here on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. If you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of 2 ways we offer those in. First one is my Twitter /X timeline at Jaden_D1. Keep in mind, letters EM, they mean does not matter. So as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. The other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And a big thanks once again to Kevin Sweeney over at The Field of 68, along with Sports Illustrated SI Now, for joining me in Lions segment, coming at you guys every single day on this podcast, regular season and off season. And I'll be back with you once again tomorrow. Thank you.